is office hours on November 10th, 2022. The question that's been raised has to do with consumption, one of the homework questions.
I'll read you the question. It's not exactly about consumption. It says, based on, obviously, I know you can't answer the question because it's homework, but based on your analysis, summarize the short run changes in employment, output, real interest rate, consumption, investment, price level, and reserve resulting from the Federal Reserve raising real interest rate. Where are we? Can you explain where to look for
Right.
this answer as far as like, are we looking at all of the graphs and then just detailing what's happening in all the graphs?
Yep. Yes. So I won't go through the question directly, like that would just be doing the answer, right? That'd be a video version of giving you the solutions, but I will equip you with the way to think about it and the way to answer it.
Okay.
All right. So I'm not trying to be evasive about it. I won't go through it exactly as if I was answering it or writing up the solutions, for example. But because it's and part of the reason for that is because I want to make sure we understand the conceptual ideas, right? Because if you understand those, then you can understand everything else. You can figure out everything else, I should say. So we'll do that. I'm going to share my screen. We'll be doing that for that, right? Because everything is about graphs and everything is about the whiteboard, right? All right, so what I have on the screen is something from earlier in the semester. Hold on, let me get my iPad situated here. So desired saving is equal to y. If you look back in the uses of saving identity back in chapter 2, this is not the uses of saving identity. When we go back, if you go back and look at this, right, then you'll see that this is desired saving, right? So if we figure out what happens to an actual saving without the D on it, in other words, is the actual output minus, or income minus C minus G for the economy. So if we figure this out and we know something about this and we know something about that, then we can figure out what's happening to C. Okay? That's the way we find out C. That's the direct answer, actually, Faith, to your question. Okay? So I want to back up, though, from that to something else that you were saying. Like, so when you have a question like this, and these will be exactly the kind of questions you'll see on the exam next week. 100%, exactly like this, right? We have the point about this is why we're practicing with this, right? So the point about this in chapter 9 is, and I'm going to draw out sort of all the pieces. Brittany saw some of this on last Thursday, actually. So we're talking about this, or maybe it was on. No, sorry, maybe it was Tuesday in the video from Tuesday when I was talking about this, right? So we have the production function. What's on the axes, right? You get to use a note sheet. I mean, it's an open book test, but you need to make a note sheet. You need to make a note sheet. Otherwise, you're going to use up lots of valuable time on the exam, right? So you should have this kind of graphs, this kind of set collection of graphs on a note sheet, right? For easy reference, right? So you don't make any silly mistakes, right? So employment, so this is y, right, equals a times k to the 0.3, n to the 0.7, right? So stuff from chapter 3. All right, chapter 3. Labor demand, labor supply, real wage, employment, right? The price, it's always the price and the quantity on the axes, right? So that determines the level of employment, full employment, the real wage, and full employment. Level of full employment labor determines, for a given amount of K, a given A, right, with A and K constant, determines potential GDP, the full employment level of output. Y potential. Okay, so that's chapter 3. Then we have the goods market, right? R, I, and S. We have, oops, we have desired investment, desired saving. That determines the real interest rate, and that determines the level of investment and the level of saving. So once we figure that, so it has to do with the goods market, right? The saving up here, consumption has to do with that, right? So now we also have, so that's from chapter 4. We'll just focus on the closed economy, right? Open economy, goods market was chapter 5, right? So I think it's my palm that's doing this, that it keeps turning off my pencil. There we go again. All right. So, and we also have the money market or asset market. And so real money demand, right? So that has to be this, that also is R. That has to be the same R as the one in the goods market. Those can't be different, right? Because we're talking about general equilibrium. We'll get to general equilibrium in just a moment. So here's the amount of money. Money demand, money supply. Let's call it M0. Key part about this is that the Federal Reserve controls the money supply through monetary policy. It's the only place where the price level occurs in our model. So the price level, when something's happening to the price level, it's going to affect this market. This market is the basis for the LM curve. So something happens to the price level, something's going to happen to the LM curve, right? So just understanding that, just conceptually, is really useful. That's chapter 7. Now,
I have a question, Dr. Simpkins.
Yep.
So I know we just talked about money supply, but what about like the money demand?
Money demand is
also-
not generally going to be moving around. That's the point, actually. So one of the previous homework said, like, what does the Federal Reserve need to know if it wants to set an interest rate at a certain level? It needs to know what money demand is, right? So it can set the money supply, shift that vertical line to the right or to the left to get whatever interest rate target it's trying to get. All right. We generally you can for our, it's not, this won't be exactly true, but for all practical purposes, you can think about the money demand curve is not changing a lot, right? It's related to the level of GDP, right? So I put a Y in there, right? So you can think about as GDP increases, you need more money, more bank accounts to buy more stuff, right? Because consumption goes up with income. Less income, less consumption, money demand is going to shift, but it's not going to shift around a lot. Money supply, and the point is, if the Federal Reserve knows that, they can shift the money supply to get the interest rate wherever they want it.
Okay, so because on the first question, that's kind of like where I was stuck, because it says illustrate, analyze, and explain what happens in the money market and the goods market for a decrease in consumer spending. And I understood what happened in the goods market, because obviously that would increase desired savings. And then which would then shift the IS curve to the left. But then in terms of the asset market or the money market.
Let's figure that out. I'm going to pause you. I'm going to pause you right. I'm intentionally interrupting. I want to pause you right there, right? Because I want to hold you. I'm going to hold you right there for a moment, right? So if you know that the IS curve shifts to the left, right? Correct? That's what you said in that case. Yes?
Yes.
All right. Pause. What happens to the equilibrium real interest rate?
It drops.
So what has to have happened in the money market?
The GDP went down. Oh.
No, well, money demand must have gone down, right?
Yeah, the money demand went down.
Yeah, that's the only way you can get the real
GDP went down.
Right, the only way you can get the real interest rate to fall, unless the price level increased. Or sorry, unless the price level decreased. Sorry, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So because the first thing happened with the goods market, then that impacts the asset market.
Yep.
Okay, I was just making sure that
and here's the point about that. This is why I wanted you to pause just for a moment ago, because it's a shift along, it's a move, sorry, it's a shift in the IS. It's a move along the LM curve. Right? When the IS curve shifts, you're moving along the LM curve. You're not shifting the LM curve, it's a move
Yeah.
along the LM curve. But you're moving to it, and every point on the LM curve, every point on the IS curve, it's an equilibrium. So every point on the LM curve is an equilibrium in the money market. So it means
Okay,
moving
so
along,
that
it means
means
the equilibrium real interest rate in the money market had to have fallen. That can only happen if the money demand went down or the money supply increased, or the real money supply increased.
so in the asset market, that means the money demand curve did shift to the left, but that only caused movement on the LM curve. Is that what you're saying?
That's correct.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank
That's
you.
correct. That's correct. So reason I wanted you to pause it, because I want to. There was a potential for an aha moment there, in the sense of how those IS and LM, aggregate demand, aggregate supply, how are they related to these underlying markets, right? So now I'm going to do the rest of the story here, right? In the what's here, right? So I drew a line across, because all of those things go into these other two graphs. These other two graphs from chapter 9 are just an agglomeration, just putting it all together. So IS, LM, real interest rate, level of real GDP, okay, and the full employment line. Whoops, they're all supposed to get together at the same point. So that point right there, so every point on the IS curve represents a place where I and S intersect in the goods market. In other words, equilibrium in the goods market. Every point on the LM curve represents the place where money demand and real money supply intersect in the asset market. And every point on the full employment line represents the place where labor demand and labor supply intersect in the labor market. So we have three markets, and the production function describe our whole economy. All right. What's on the so from our model, what can we figure out? We can figure out the real wage, we can figure out employment, we can figure out GDP, we can figure out investment and saving, right? And the real interest rate. Those are our variables. So that's what you see in the homework question. That's what you'll see on exam. What happens to each of those variables? That's that, because in other words, we can't just stop with the IS and LM and FE and aggregate demand, short run aggregate supply, and long run aggregate supply, because there we add a new one in, price level. So price level, now we got that there too, right? And GDP, right? This is Y bar, this is Y bar. So these aren't separate models. This is just a putting together of all the other markets. The four diagrams, the four graphs that you see above. They're not separate from that. They come out of that, right? They're from that. So what's interesting, in the Principles of Macroeconomics course, Econ 201, the model that we use there is aggregate demand, aggregate supply. That's what you learned about in Econ 201. So we don't tell you where that all comes from, but in an intermediate level course, that's the key theory course as an econ major, just like Econ 311 is a key microeconomics course, economic theory course. We go through and derive where the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model comes from. And it comes from those four graphs up above. Okay. So the place where all of these lines cross is what we call general equilibrium. Why is it called general equilibrium?
Because in the long run, when all the prices adjust.
Yes.
And because it's in all three of the markets.
Right. It's
well as on the
equilibrium in
phone
all
for
the
that.
markets at the same time. And so the big idea here, I'll relate it back to what Faith was just saying, right? It's if something happens to shock the economy. So this was chapter 8. Chapter 8 was talking about business cycle behavior. That's the first time we heard about business cycle behavior. And the whole idea is that something, the way economists think about this in macroeconomics, is something happens to knock the economy out of long-run potential GDP, off its long-run growth path, right? And cause a recession, and then maybe an expansion, right? So the idea is, but what you see is that business cycles all fluctuate around the long-run growth in the economy. So the question is, well, what brings the economy back to full employment, to potential GDP? Well,
By changing the price level, right?
changes in the price level. So the whole thing hinges on, ultimately, prices will adjust, wages and prices will adjust to bring the this is the core assumption underneath the model, that ultimately prices and wages will adjust to bring the economy back into equilibrium at full employment. In other words, in our model, we're all three lines crossing, right? Now, the deal with that is, well, but how long does it take for prices to adjust? The answer to that is the whole distinction laid out, first of all, in chapter 1 of our textbook, between the classical model and the Keynesian model. The classical model says prices are pretty flexible. They change, they adjust quickly. The Keynesian model has a different assumption. It says, no, prices don't adjust quickly. And if they don't adjust quickly, well, what does that mean? Well, it means that you don't get back to general equilibrium very quickly. You stay out of equilibrium. And what's out of equilibrium? Generally, employment, right? And so Keynesian economics, it looks like Keynesian, but it's Keynesian, right? So you can go back to chapter 1, look back in chapter 1. This is where it all comes together, right? And Keynes was writing after the Great Depression. He was trying to understand, trying to explain, how can you have a whole decade, 1930 to 1940, roughly, where the unemployment rate is like 10%, as high as 25%. Like, that's not full employment. Like, the classical economists before say 1930 would have said, like, oh, we just need to wait, prices will adjust, wages will adjust, we'll get back to full employment, like, no worries. So it wasn't that there weren't business cycles before that, they just happened, and there was no intervention in the economy, and they just happened, periodically. But then we had the Great Depression, and a decade-long period where unemployment rates were high, the economy clearly was not back at full employment, wages and prices clearly did not adjust to bring the economy back to full employment at that time. So Keynes is trying to understand it. So why is that? And that's where the theory, this idea of prices being sticky, not adjusting very quickly, and the whole idea of these models really came into play. Let me just make one other point about that, and we'll get back to this idea about consumption and how that affects other markets, right? So, if the economy is out of general equilibrium for a long time, right? That means that unemployment rate is high. You're not at full employment. A lot of people out of work. That's not good, right? So there's a cost, in other words, to that, human and economic, because if people are out of work, that's stuff that's not being produced, right? And so people don't have stuff, whether it's food or cars or houses or whatever, right? Not as much as being produced, right? And so, in that case, right? This is Keynes now saying, like, no, we can't rely on the market to get back to, for the economy to get back to full employment. Like, no, we've seen, like, it's been a decade, it still isn't back. Like, no. So in that case, maybe we need the government to intervene. Fiscal policy. We need the government to increase spending or reduce taxes in that case. To do what? To move the IS curve back to the right, to move the aggregate demand curve back to the right, to full employment, to get us back to full employment. So the history that you learned in high school, right, from that period of time, the Great Work Society, et cetera, everything sort of after that, right, in the 1940s onward, into the 50s and into the 60s even, right, was based largely on this Keynesian idea. And so the Works Progress Administration, WPA, national parks, the interstate highway system in the United States was built, dams like Hoover Dam, other things like that. That was the government paying for projects, who then hired people to build those things. And that increased spending, aggregate demand, consumer spending, right? Because people had more income, people had work, right? And so that was the whole idea behind that. It was all of that stuff that happened was all economics. It was all economics. So today, right? Today, it wasn't a big deal then, but over time, what's also become another lever to pull in that case is monetary policy, the Federal Reserve. Federal Reserve was around at that time, right? It had been around since the early 1900s, but it wasn't seen as this big policy player at that time. Keynes was writing about fiscal policy, really, right? But now today, we also have this other lever that is monetary policy, and the Federal Reserve can change the money supply, can change interest rates to try and change spending to do what? To get us back to full employment, or alternatively, like now, to reduce inflation. But it's all about, so all of these things. So that's a shift in the LM curve. Fiscal policy is a shift in the IS curve. All of these things are shifts in aggregate demand. So economic policy, fiscal policy, changes in taxes, changes in government spending, changes in taxes affect what? They affect, they affect what? Government spending, taxes affect consumption, right? And all of that affects aggregate demand. Remember, aggregate demand is made up of C plus I plus G plus net exports. We don't worry about that so much. We'll think about these components primarily here. All right. Anything that increases one of those or all of them is going to increase aggregate demand. Policy is primarily, not all, but primarily about aggregate demand, unless fiscal policy affects what? Could affect what? The production function, right? By trying to increase capital, trying to increase technology, infrastructure in the economy, et cetera. Remember, we learned about that back in chapter 6, back in chapter 3, right? Long run economic growth, things that affect that, right? Like technology. We've had questions about that on 2 different exams now, right? Changes in infrastructure, changes in technology, and you have a question on this homework about that, right? That's going to affect what? That's about the labor market, the production function, right? But that's about what? That's about the FE curve, right? So the FE curve has to do with, whoops, come on. The FE curve has to do with, right? Production function and labor market. IS curve has to do with the goods market. LM curve has to do with the money market. The IS and LM, come on here. The IS and LM together have to do with aggregate demand. The production function and labor market have to do with the long run aggregate supply curve and the FE curve. They're the same thing. Just one has price level on the axis, the other one has the real interest rate on the axis, but both of them are measuring potential GDP. Let me say one other thing, and then let's go through an example here. All right. So this is not a model, this is data. So let's say we have calendar year on the horizontal axis. We have real GDP on the vertical axis. Right? So back in chapter 3 and in chapter 6, we were talking about the long run growth of the economy. Right? So this is potential GDP. Oh, let's say this is 1940 and let's say this is 2022, right? This is like a Fred graph, a graph from Fred. Right? So here's the real GDP, potential real GDP in 1940, and I'm just picking that year as a starting point, just because potential GDP in 1940. Here's potential GDP in, let's say, 2022. Right? This is the increase in living standards that we were talking about over time, back in chapter 3 and chapter 6. So what causes that to grow over time? Changes in the production function, changes in labor, which affect labor demand and also labor supply. Because that can either move you along the production function or shift the production function, right? Over time. So that's the chapter 3 stuff we did. So that's what leads to this picture. So that's an increase in living standards over time. You can look back at questions from the homework from, say, probably homework 2 from the first exam, right? Those are questions about that. Well, we could also plot in any given year actual GDP, which is different, which could be the same, could be different than potential GDP. Sometimes the economy might be operating below potential GDP. Other times it could be above, right? This is what? This is the business cycle, right? That line is actual GDP. So what happens when the economy, when actual GDP, so this could be real GDP, either potential or actual that we're showing here. So if the economy is turning down, actual GDP, right? This is actual GDP in the orange. Come on. Yeah. Okay. Actual GDP in the orange. If it's turning down, right? Going down from year to year. What do we call that?
Recession.
It's a recession. And when it's going up, what do we call that?
Expansion.
An expansion. It's a business cycle expansion. So we learned in chapter 8 is that's what business cycles are all about. Recessions and expansion, followed by expansion, followed by a recession, followed by expansion, but they're all kind of fluctuating around this long run trend, right? Over time, things are real, standards of living have increased over time. But on any given year, any given month, right, things might be getting worse or things might be getting better. This is just one measure of that. This is in terms of real GDP. We don't just use real GDP. That was the point in chapter 8. We use a variety of different indicators to tell us about what's happening in the economy. So what's happening when real GDP, when we have a recession? What's happening to employment? Just in general.
Can you repeat that?
So when we have a recession, what's happening to employment?
Increasing. Wait, unemployment is increasing.
Unemployment is increasing.
Yeah, so employment is decreasing.
Oops, increasing, sorry. Employment is decreasing. Fewer jobs. Why are there fewer jobs? Because there's not enough spending for the production that there is. So firms lay off workers. Right? So in the news, if you're following the news, right? That's one of the things ask you to do, right? If you're following the news, right? Who just laid off a third of their workforce?
Meta.
They're not actually a third. Before that, that's next. That was the next one. Meta's dropping maybe 15% or something like that. Is what it's, I think, is what they were saying. All right. Before that, week or two before that,
Twitter.
Elon Musk, right? Took over, bought Twitter, took it private, and laid off, or no, didn't lay off, sorry, fired about, I don't know, a half or whatever, a third, half, whatever it is, of the employees. Okay. But that one's a little different because that's Elon Musk buying it out. And there's a whole set of other things going on there. But why is Meta, you know, why are they laying off workers? Well, why do you lay off workers? Because what's happening to profits? What's happening to profits?
Yeah, they're losing profit.
They're
But
losing
isn't it
money.
also because of the
And
economy?
what and how do they make their money?
Through consumers?
Yeah, maybe, but not so
They're
much.
producing.
How does Google make its, well, on the web part, right? Which is really the meta part. It's not completely the meta part either, right? Because the meta is about metaverse, right? But but that's Mark Zuckerberg's kind of big idea, right? But how does Facebook, right? Of which, right? Meta is a parent company, right? How does Google? How do they make their money? You get it. I mean, you get the content free, right? You don't have to pay be on Facebook, right? How do they make their money? Advertising. It's advertising. What's happened? Advertising is dried up. Not dried up, but it's gone down significantly. Why? Well, part of the reason is because firms are concerned about where the economy is going. It might be going into a recession, right? They're not sure, but you know, people aren't sure, but they're not spending as much on advertising right now. So, you know, that's so, you know, so what's going to happen? Employment goes down. People they don't hire as many workers, right? Or they lay workers off, right? So these things are all connected. That's what chapter 8 was about. Saying when there's a business cycle, when there's a downturn in the economy, it doesn't just happen to GDP, it happens to employment, it happens to spending, it happens to investment spending, it happens to consumer spending, it happens to all sorts of things in the economy at the same time, roughly. That's the whole point of chapter 8. It was setting you up for chapter 9. So how is this related to chapter 9? Chapter 9 is ultimately about how can we predict and explain these cycles? What causes the economy? So I'm trying to give you this sort of broad idea so that you have the conceptual bucket kind of to understand what we're doing when we ask the specific questions. We'll come to that, right? But what causes, so what's the question then? What causes actual GDP to fall? In our model, it's either a shift to the left of IS, a shift to the left of LM, a shift to the left of AS, or sorry, aggregate demand, right? Typically, it has to do primarily with spending. It could be a supply side shock too, but there are shocks to the economy that knock us off of our long run trend and either cause us to grow above the trend or fall. Business cycles. So what forecasters do, right? So if you're working at the Board of Governors, the Federal Reserve, they're running models, businesses run models, banks run models that are based essentially on the graphs that we have they're econometric models, they're statistical models, but they're essentially, the economics underneath it is exactly what we're doing, but in graphical form, to predict what's going to happen to real GDP, the real interest rate, the price level, employment, real wages, etc. And to do that, they have to think about, well, what kinds of shocks are hitting the economy? Shocks or policy, right? Either shocks or policy. So let's go through a specific. Let's go through an actual example of that.
Before we go through an example, I actually have another question.
All right.
So like, obviously, like when we increase government spending, that would decrease desired savings. But like in terms of like the production function, like I'm kind of confused on government spending.
Right. So this is going to be really important. All right. That's a good question. It's a really good question. Really important question. This, hopefully there's an aha moment here. All right. So, and if you go back and reread chapters, I'm not asking you to reread chapters, but if you do, you'll see that it's actually been talked about there. All right. So I'm going to draw a line. What determines long-run aggregate supply in the full employment line? Well,
Isn't it like labor demand and labor supply?
Labor demand, labor supply.
Yeah.
Chapter 3. It's what determines the long-run potential GDP. That's what that was all about, long-run growth at the time. So here's the full employment potential, general equilibrium, level of GDP, potential GDP. This is not the actual line, right? This is the potential line. Okay? What we're going to be interested in is what causes deviations between potential and actual GDP, because that's telling us what happens in the business cycle in the short run. Potential GDP is talking about what's happening over the long run, right? Over a decade, 2 decades, a century, right? Whereas actual GDP is what's happening every month, every week, every day, right? So this level of potential GDP, what is this production function determined by? The level of employment, the level of capital, the level of technology and infrastructure, et cetera, right? If it's not there, it's not affecting that. So what's the answer to your question?
So I realized that like, would A be considered government spending?
That's a good way to ask a question. That's question back. That's good. No, I mean that actually. So all government spending is not the same, right?
Mm-hmm.
What do I mean
On
by
infrastructure?
that? So so we had a question about this on back in the goods market. I'm trying to think which one of the homeworks. There may have been a question on the exam too. I don't remember now exactly. Certainly in a homework, and it gave 2 different examples. There's a homework question. Examples of, so this actually isn't government spending going up, but it has to do with the budget deficit. But if the government takes $1 trillion and uses it to give everybody COVID checks, or they take $1 trillion and they use it to create new broadband infrastructure, in other words, internet for rural areas, repair roads, bridges, ports, infrastructure bill, right? Which one's going to have a bigger impact on the economy? This is directly related to your question. How do you break that down? This is what economists do. We break it down. Which one affects the production function? The COVID check or the infrastructure bill?
Infrastructure.
Why is it? Why do you have a
Can't
question?
both of them?
Why do you have a question mark at the end of that? That's my question. If
I
you
don't
get a check, which we all did, if you get a check, does it affect A? Does it affect K? Does it affect N? It could affect N, but probably not so much. There was actually an interesting economic question about that, right? Maybe it affects labor supply. Maybe you could make that argument. In that case, it would affect the full employment line a bit. But no, you're going to do what? What was the point of the government cutting checks for people during COVID? Not once.
Well, it would like increase consumption because people would
Yes,
start
exactly.
spending.
Increased consumption. That's exactly right. Which has to do with which curve? IS, aggregate demand, spending. There are only two things. This is the way to really keep it simple. Either affects spending or it affects production. If it's production,
Okay, but that.
go ahead. Go ahead.
I was gonna say, but yeah, like that was for the checks, but like the
Yes.
infrastructure
Yes,
is the
yes.
technology.
Yes. Now tell me about that. Yes, that's right. What's that
Well, yeah,
gonna
I was just gonna say.
That's this,
It's
right?
gonna,
That's A, right?
yeah.
And that's going to do what? That's
So
going
would
to
it
shift this
move
up,
along
right?
the production?
No, it's
Okay,
going to shift it up, right? It's going to shift it up. The same level of employment can now produce more stuff. But not only that, what we learned in chapter 3 is that increases the marginal product of labor because it increases the slope of the production function, right? So now we also get more employment and higher real wages and potential GDP increases. What does that mean in terms of what? So over here, right? Over here, let me just finish the thought. I'm going to come back to that, but I'm going to really do this part quickly, right? Over here is INS and the asset, and then the asset market, money demand, real money supply, MS over P, right? And this side of the line over here, spending. This side of the line, production. Production, FE, longer aggregate supply curve. Spending, IS, aggregate demand. Like that is the simplest, that is the most stripped down way I can say it. But this is, so in terms of studying, this is exactly what you should be doing to get to this point. When you get to this point, instead of like, oh, I see how that works. But you actually have to draw out these graphs. You need to sit and work with, sit with this and think through it. But when you get to that point, you can say like, oh, I get this. I see, right? Because it either has to do with spending or it has to do with production. If it has to do with production, it either has to do with labor supply or it has to do with capital, or primarily more so it has to do with A, right? But it could deal with capital, the capital stock as well, right? So this is supply side shocks. If you go back to chapter 3, you'll actually see negative supply side shocks. There's a section about that actually, right? And this has to do with demand. So spending, demand, production, supply. Demand and supply in the overall economy. That's what we're talking about in terms of general equilibrium. You know, but we have to understand what's underneath the hood, though. All right, that's what all these pieces are. And yes, you need to know what's underneath the hood. All right, underneath the hood of the car. That's what I'm talking about, right? And so, if you think about this, then, and I said this earlier, spending has to do with consumption, investment, government spending. Right? Investments here. All right. Consumption is the other side of saving. And government spending is part of national saving. Whoops. All right. Changes in the money supply. Come on here. Whoops. Changes in the money supply, right, by the Federal Reserve have changed interest rates, and that affects spending, consumption, and investment spending. So anything related to policy, fiscal policy, oh, but I'm going to come back from that, Simone, just hold on to that, and monetary policy are all aimed at spending, except when fiscal policy is aimed at what? Fiscal policy can be aimed at A, right? Fiscal policy, government spending on what? Free education, right? Didn't pass, didn't happen, right? Policy aimed at reducing student loan debt, sorry. That's actually not really the case because that's already stuff that's happened, right? It's not actually, that actually isn't having an impact on this in that sense, all right? But more support for early childhood education, Head Start kind of programs, supply side, right? Has to do with increasing the productive capacity of the economy. But most government spending, except recently, right, is really focused on changes in taxes, right? If they're consumer taxes, income taxes, that's aimed at spending, right? It's aimed at spending. It's aimed at demand. So let's look at an example to help see if this helps, see if this makes it clear, right? So let's say that let's see. Let's say that so here's the scenario. There are really only a few specific questions I can ask, actually. Businesses businesses are concerned about the future state of the economy. They're pessimistic about the future state of the economy. They think there might be a recession coming. And so they cut back on business spending. What do we call business spending? Investment.
Investment.
Right? So investment in, they're buying fewer computers. They're not going to, they're buying fewer computers. They're not expanding. They're not building a new warehouse. They are not investing in new software, etc. Right? Like they're just going to hold tight until they figure out what's happening in the economy. Right? Because you're not going to. So, or if we don't think even just about a big company, you have a food truck. All right, you're an entrepreneur, you have a food truck, you're thinking about getting a second food truck, right? Expanding so you can increase your profits. But if you think that the economy is going down, well, consumers aren't going to spend as much, then you probably aren't going to do that because you got to borrow money to get this other food truck and you got to make the payments on that. But if you don't have an income coming in, you're gonna crash and burn, right? So you don't buy the second food truck. That's less spending than you would have done otherwise. Less investment spending. All right. So let's look at that. So we're going to start with the ISLM FE, real interest rate, in real GDP. Generally, we're going to start in general equilibrium. In other words, where the lines cross to begin with. We don't have to, but generally that's the case. And we're going to have, so here is aggregate demand. So these two work hand in hand. They're both models of general equilibrium. Oops, no, sorry, didn't mean to do that. Short run average supply. And long run average supply. Long run average supply is a marker of what's happening to potential GDP, full employment GDP. So where do we start? Where do you want to start? Aggregate demand, aggregate supply, or ISLM? That's not like a trick question. We could start either way. In this case, we can start either place. Always label everything to start with, by the way. Yeah. So this is our starting point. We haven't done anything yet with the scenario, right? Now let's see what so the shock happens. What's the shock? The shock is businesses cut back on spending. That's going to set a chain reaction of things into motion. That's what we're doing here.
Okay. Can I like tell you what I think the next step should be?
Yep, that's what I'm looking for.
Okay. So basically you said that the investment decreased. So the little graph that I would draw next would be the goods market.
Bingo.
And
That's exactly right. Exactly. So let me catch up with you. Let me catch up with you. Yeah. All right.
And then I would shift. Right. Yeah, that's the original point.
Yep. That's
and then shift the investment desired curve to the left.
That's exactly right.
And that would create a new real interest rate that's lower than the previous one.
Yeah.
So then we go to the IS curve we would shift that to the left.
Or down, because for the same.
Or down.
Either way, that's fine. No, that's fine. What you said is fine. But what we're actually doing, right, is because we know it's gone down, the interest rate's gone down, right? So if the IS curve to get a lower interest rate, it's got to go down or to the left, right?
Right.
So I'm just saying, in your mind, you can check, these are checks and balances in your mind. Like it can't shift to the right, because if it did, the interest rate would go up, right?
Would go up, exactly.
But it can't, because we just showed that. So all I'm saying is you can check yourself along the way. You don't need to wonder like, oh, did I do anyway? Yeah.
Okay, so then because now like you've kind of drawn that new point, you realize there's like a decrease in GDP. So then the next market that I would look at would be the asset.
We're gonna go here, right?
Right. So
so our one blower, and now has potential GDP changed? No. Actual GDP has changed. This is why I drew that other graph before, right? So
when something changes, would another curve change? Like I see the IS curve shifted to the left. The LM curve no other curve would move.
That's correct. Not yet, anyway.
Not yet.
Yeah, we'll get there. We'll get there.
So now
that's B.
Wouldn't you look at the asset curve?
Well, let's go over to aggregate demand. So in the short run, right? In the short run, like that's the end for that graph for right now. For in the short run, we're going to come back. Let's go over to aggregate demand, aggregate supply. What's happening there?
It's also going to shift down because
which one?
The aggregate demand curve, because IS shifted down, and if IS or LM moves, so does the aggregate demand curve.
Yeah, that's right.
What letter are we on?
What
We're
le-
just doing an example that he created.
That's right. I'm not doing any of the examples. That's why I had to pause before. I want to do one. I have to do one that's not the same as. But if you think about it later, this is very similar to one that you're doing in the homework. So it's just not the same, but similar general idea. So what happens? Where do we go? Where do we go when aggregate demand shifts to the left in this case? Let me actually finish off the thought what I was just saying. So I won't be quite as cryptic about that, right? Aggregate demand is made up of spending, right? Consumer spending, business spending, government spending. If any of those goes down, it's going to shift to the left, right? There's less demand. And how do we measure demand? We measure demand on this axis, right? On the horizontal axis, right? So if investment spending went down, that means aggregate demand went down. So what would be true? The same thing would be true if government spending went down. The same thing would be true if consumer spending went down. There would all. So if I showed you a shift, so if we flip this around, I'm coming back to you, Simone. So, but if we flip this around, no, who was talking before? I've lost track. No, Jasmine. I'm sorry, not Simone. Sorry, I knew that wasn't right. Like what? No, well, it's not here. So I'm coming back to you, Jasmine. Sorry. If I flipped it around and said like, oh, there's something that shifts aggregate demand to the left. Instead of starting up by saying, oh, there's something that happens to cause businesses to reduce investment spending. If instead I started up by saying something shifts aggregate demand to the left, the spending goes down in the economy. What caused that? You wouldn't know the specific thing. You said, well, it's either a reduction in consumer spending or investment spending or government spending or all three. Right? So in terms of the graph, they would be identical. They're identical. So where do we end up, Jasmine? Where do we end up on here? Tell me in words, and I'll draw it.
Okay,
Where's B?
so
Where's
now
B in terms of aggregate demand, aggregate supply? Yeah.
Oh, it's well, it's like underneath A, where the red dots and the long run aggregate supply curve touch.
Let's think through that for a second. Let's check that.
Wait, no, because we're doing short run.
This is well, and even without that, just thinking through that, if that was true,
Because the price level hasn't changed.
well, that's right. That's exactly right. That is exactly right. But even before that, that's exactly correct. But so if it went down to here where I drew the dot, what would have happened to GDP in that case? The actual GDP hasn't
The
changed.
GDP would have stayed the same. Yeah.
But over here, we know that's not true. That would, so
Right.
if you did that on the homework, if you did that on an exam, I would say I would draw big arrows and I'd say that's not consistent. So what you want to be checking when you in this stuff is all your graphs should match up. There can't be any inconsistencies. So that sounds like a big task, but no, that's actually a way to check yourself. Which is kind of what, which is a version of what you just did. You just kind of checked yourself in that case. Oh, and I didn't mean to draw that, undo that whole thing there. Let's put the long aggregate supply curve back in. And right. So we're over here, right? Right, B is here, right? Do you agree?
Yeah.
All right. So that's the actual level of GDP. Boom. That looks just like that one, right? Looks the same, right? Actual is below potential, right?
Yes.
What do we call it when actual is below potential? What do we call that?
Recession.
That's a recession. That's why I drew this graph up here. When actual level of GDP is below potential GDP, that's a recession. There's what's called a GDP gap. There's a gap between, so the GDP gap is the actual, you can do this either way, actual minus potential. The economy's not at full employment because then we'd be at potential GDP, right? So employment, so one of the things that, I'll come back to that. Let's just finish this off, right? So that's the short run. That's the short run, right? Boom, boom, boom. Now, we could include the asset market here, all right? We should put that in there too. The real interest rates there, right? What happened? What's happened in the asset market at this point? Price level hasn't changed, right? All right, we're still at P0. What's happened to the real interest rate? What's happened to the real interest
It
rate?
decreased.
Decreased. So
went
what's
down.
happened? Money demand has gone down, right? I mean, it was at R0, so because the Federal Reserve changes the money supply, nothing's happened to P at this point. So that hasn't changed. The Federal Reserve is the one who changes the money supply. Nothing's happened with the Federal Reserve. They haven't done anything. Right? We haven't talked to anything that's what we call exogenous. That's separate from, right? So money demand went down. Does that make sense? Yes, because actual spending, actual GDP went down. So there's less demand for money, right? Because money demand is tied to GDP. So that's all consistent, right? Model's all internally consistent there. The story is all internally consistent. So this orange stuff up here, the goods market, money market. So nothing's happened. Nothing's happened over here. Nothing's happened on the supply side. Full employment line hasn't shifted. Long-run average supply curve hasn't shifted. Nothing's happened over there. It's all over here on the demand side. Spending has to do with demand, unless government spending is spending on something that's affecting the production function. That's the only time, right? When spending and supply intersect. So I gave you one of those problems actually, didn't I, on the homework? Increased government spending on infrastructure. So that one will have a shift in long-run average supply and will increase, and will have an impact on spending and production as well. So that's one of the few times when we have two curves shifting. So I'm telling you that. That's one of the benefits of being here today. I'm not going to go through that problem, but I'm telling you there are two curves that shift, because that is an instance where I was very specific about the kind of government spending, because that's actually the point of the infrastructure bill that was passed and why it got bipartisan support, because it affected long-run growth. That was the aim of it. That was and Republicans and Democrats could both agree about that. Except Joe Manchin didn't for a while, but he finally got him over the hump. All right, short run. Now, the rest of this is actually pretty short, pretty easy, easier, a shorter story. So, why is this not the end of the story? Why is B not the end of the story?
Because it's not intersecting with the long run aggregate supply, which means that the price level has to change.
Now you are like 70% of the way there with that. Now let's get the other 30%. I need to know the economics behind that. Why does the price level change? That's correct. What you said is correct, is a correct statement. That's a mechanical memorization. This is not a criticism of what you said. I'm just saying that's a mechanical, I can memorize, that's what happens when in that situation. But there's a reason why it happens. There's an economic reason why it happens.
Well,
if you get this, then you'll really get it. You'll really, really get it.
Does it,
So what,
does it
go
have
ahead.
to do with full employment
Yeah,
possibly?
yes, that's part
We're
of it.
trying to reach full employment.
But what do you mean we're trying, what's trying to reach full employment? Who's trying to reach full employment? The market will go to full employment. Why will it go to full employment? Through changes in the price level. That's the question. Why? That's why I say you're 3/4 of the way there, but the other quarter is really important. So here's the deal. I'm hoping you have an aha moment, everybody that's here. All right. So when we're at B, let's use the aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph, right? This is the way to think about it. Right. So what is actual GDP really measuring? Measuring aggregate demand, right? Demand for goods and services, spending by consumers, see businesses and government, right? This is the amount of demand for goods and services in the economy, right? That's what's measured, right? We're on the aggregate demand curve, right? You with me on that one? Where is aggregate supply? Where relative to the productive capacity of the economy? Where is aggregate supply? Right here. Now we're on the short run aggregate supply curve. That's correct, right? But
So we want to reach potential GDP again. That's why.
Well, it's not that we want. It's not that we want to. What's going to cause the economy to go there, and why?
A change in the price level.
A change in the price level. Why? This is the key. It's this last why. That's the key part here. Is demand equal to supply? If this is 100, this would be 80, let's say. All right. What's true about demand versus supply?
In equilibrium, they're equal to each other?
Are they equal here at B?
No.
80 is the spending, 100 is the supply that could be produced in the economy at full employment. There's less demand than supply, right? What do we call that? When supply is greater than demand, what do we call that? A surplus, right? I mean, this goes back to principles of economics. And don't overthink it. Don't overthink it. Right? There's not enough spent. So in the real world, so let's just step. I'm literally stepping back away from the graph now. All right. In the real world, what does this mean? Firms are producing a bunch of cars. Let's think about the car industry. They're producing. Things have been, demand was going like gangbusters, right? Blah 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 blah, right? And now there's less demand in the economy overall. Right? So before they were able to sell all the cars that were going out of the factory, right? But now there's less demand. Fewer customers coming to car dealers, fewer orders from car dealers for cars from GM or Ford or whoever. What's happening? What's happening to the cars that they're producing? They're just piling up, right? Ford's got a big surplus of cars. They're sitting on some factory lot, right? Because there's not enough people buying the cars because now there are not as many people buying stuff. That's a surplus. What do they do to get rid of the cars? Well, first, they would reduce prices if they could, but what do they first do? They cut back on production. But eventually, if that surplus stays there, what's going to happen to the prices of cars? We've just been going through the opposite over the last year in the US. The price is going to go down, right? Anytime there's a surplus, price is going to go down. So basic economics. The aha moment here has got to be for you that if demand, if all three lines are not crossing at the same point, that creates a place that the situation then is either aggregate demand is greater or less than aggregate supply. There's either a shortage or a surplus. And the economy responds to shortages and surpluses by prices changing. So there's a shortage that causes the price level to go down. When does the price level stop going down? When there's no more shortage, when demand equals supply at C, right? So it's not that we want the price to go down. It's not that somebody else is making the price go down. It's that the markets create that just through the invisible hand, Adam Smith's invisible hand, the shortages and surpluses. So the short narrow supply curve, prices. So it's a true statement that prices will adjust to bring the economy back to full employment. But that's not a complete state. That's not a complete explanation. That'll get you to 8 out of 10 points, maybe. Okay, 8 out of 10, maybe 7 out of 10. I don't know, 8 out of 10, let's say. Right? And so if you want to get to the 9 or 10 out of 10, you got to explain the why part, because it's really important. What happens over in terms of IS and LM and FE? Where is C over here in this graph? If price goes down, what happens in the asset market? MS over P, if P is going down, that's in the denominator. What happens to the real money supply?
It goes up, so it moves to the right.
It goes up, real money supply shifts to the right, the real interest rate goes down, all right? The LM curve shifts down and to the right, therefore, all right, which has to be a lower interest rate. Okay, we could go through the economics that demand and supply for money is out of balance.
Wait,
Interest rate will adjust to bring it down.
but this is when we're trying to adjust it.
Not when we're
to
trying to
general
adjust, not when we're
equilibrium.
trying to adjust it. This is what the market will do. That's the assumption.
Okay, Gotcha.
But let's take that example. Well, we might have a little bit more. I'm going to redo this, and let's think about that. I won't do it on this graph because it'll start to get really messy. All right. So one way for this is going to go full circle to what I was talking about at the very beginning when we started today. One way for the economy to go back to full employment is to wait for the price level to adjust. Right? So Jasmine, that's exactly what you said at the beginning here. What's going to happen? Why is B not the end of the story? And you said, because prices. Pardon?
I was gonna say, or isn't there another option that
Yes, there is. I'm just summarizing.
okay.
I'm just summarizing where we're at to make sure everybody's clear on this part before I do that. So this is option one. Let the market, don't intervene in the market, don't do anything. The market will adjust, and the way it will adjust is the price level will adjust. What's the question with that? How long will that take? If you're Keynes, John Maynard Keynes, you would say, we are going to get stuck at B for potentially a long time. If we're at B, that means we're in a what? In a recession for a long time. That's people out of work for a long time. That's not good. Right? So maybe if prices don't adjust very quickly, maybe we should do something to try and get back to full employment. What can we do? All right, so let's just go with that one. It won't take as long to do that because now we kind of have the mechanics of this. I'm going to redraw the graph. And the only way you get better at this is literally by doing this, by drawing the graphs and working them through. It's literally the only way to do it. Like, you can't just watch me do it. You'll never get really good at it if you do that. At working through the whys. Whoops, sorry. Oh, Somebody needed to stop me back here. This is not right, right? That's not what goes on that axis. It's Y on that axis, right? It's Y. It's real GDP on that axis. General equilibrium, or sorry, full employment line. We start out there. So this is a general equilibrium, call it price level 0, Y 0. Potential GDP, that's why I put that bar over it. Potential GDP, full employment. It's the marker for full employment, potential GDP. You said IS curve shifts to the left, right? Correct for this model, right? So we end up at B. Real GDP, actual GDP, less than potential GDP. Think about potential GDP as the aggregate, as supply in the economy, the potential supply in the economy. Think about that as, that's why it's called, no, sorry. We'll just do it on the other graph. It's the supply, right? We'll do it over here. Aggregate demand shifting to the left. I'm going to summarize this in sort of in a broad way when we're done this specific example, right? So he said, oh, so actual GDP is less than potential GDP. That's a recession. That's what it means to have a recession. That's what a recession means, right? Let's go back to this graph we did up here, right? This right here, below potential GDP, recession. Right, something caused GDP to go down. Right, this is the shock. Right, in this case, it was businesses spending less on new equipment and stuff. Right, because they're worried about a recession in the future. Notice that their decision to spend less actually does what? Causes a recession. So it's a self-fulfilling prophecy in that case. They think there's going to be a recession. They cut back spending. Recession happens. Yep. So what if prices don't adjust quickly? This is Jasmine, this is your question. No. We're at B. Now what? How can we get back to full employment? Let's do the aggregate demand, aggregate supply, the right side here first. That'll be the simplest one. How can we get back to full employment? We said before that we can wait for the price level to fall. All right. Short run aggregate supply curve shifts down till all three lines cross again. How else can we get all three lines to cross?
Could we increase the money supply?
Okay. Yes.
Which shifts the LM curve.
Okay, you're starting over here. That's
down.
fine. We're fine. I didn't want to go there yet, but no, we're good. We're good. This is good. That's correct. I was going to do the easy part first, but yes. And that's going to shift it to the right, right? So that's monetary policy. That's monetary policy. That's the Federal Reserve, right?
Right.
Federal Reserve doing what? Lowering interest rates, right?
Right.
Right. So if it does that, boom, right? What about over an aggregate demand, aggregate supply land?
Oh, then the aggregate demand term moves more towards the right again, or back, because
back to A.
The LM just shifted.
C is the new A.
Yep.
Boom. Perfect. Yes. How else could we get back there? So we can use monetary policy to get back to full employment. What did the Federal Reserve do since 2008, 2009, up until, and then again during COVID? What did it do? It reduced
lower interest
rates to zero, the federal funds rate to zero, to do what? To spur spending, right? What's underneath the IIS? So what's underneath I and well, sorry, it's moving along the IS curve, right? In that case, right? Moving along the IS curve, it's increasing GDP. So along with, so it's increasing saving, and it's also increasing spending on investments. So businesses borrowing costs were lower, reduces the user cost of capital. Back in chapter 3, right? So there's going to be more, no, 4, going to be more investment in new buildings and new machines and stuff. Lower interest rates, lower mortgage rates on houses, borrowing money for houses, more housing. Back in chapter 2, when we measured GDP, there was a homework assignment. What's in C and I and G and net exports? New housing is in part of I, investment spending. It's included there. So all those things are happening. Like, that's what happened in the real economy. That's really what happened, right? So all sorts of spending is part of what led to a big housing boom, right? And housing prices going up big time because interest rates were so cheap, right? So, and the economy was expanding, right? We were going back to full employment. Unemployment rate was going down to a 50-year low, right? Donald Trump used to say, like, he used to say this before the last election, like, the unemployment rate for blacks is lower than it's ever been since we started measuring it, right? And he was correct. It wasn't because of him, it was because of the Federal Reserve doing this, but that was correct. Yeah. Hold on just a moment. I have a faculty member here. A minute. Hold on just a second. I'll pause that for a second. I can find my no, I don't want to do that. Where are my controls? All right. Pause. I'll come back to that. Hold on just a moment. All right. Sorry about that.
Dr. Simpkins, I have a few non-homework related questions.
Yeah, let's finish off this question first. How about that? Because I want to make what's going on? Okay. I want to make a point about this. So, because we're not really done with this yet. So we can use monetary policy to do it, to get back from B back to full employment. Or, so how else can, so what do we say? We can shift aggregate demand by increasing the money supply, right? LM shift, LM increases or the shifts right. All right. How else could we shift aggregate demand back? Increase government spending, reduce taxes. Fiscal policy, right? You reduce taxes, consumption goes up, right? You have more income, more disposable income. Marginal propensity to consume is less than 1. So you're going to increase spending. So that would do what? That would shift the alternative here to shifting the LM curve back from B is to shift the IS curve back, right? So in that case, we get back to C in that case is here. So we can either shift the LM, this is fiscal policy. We could, in other words, increase G, reduce taxes, which increases consumption. That's the whole point of reducing taxes. So monetary and fiscal policy do what? They affect aggregate demand. Either IS or LM, but ultimately aggregate demand. All right. So you can get out of a recession by using fiscal or monetary policy. So the Federal Reserve can lower interest rates, but if they lower interest rates too much, what happens? Aggregate demand can end up way out here, right? Because it's not an exact science. Right? They lower this is the question over the last year. Like, okay, when do they need to start raising interest rates? Because what was happening, right? They pushed aggregate demand was too far out beyond potential GDP. And what was starting to happen? The price level was starting to go up. Inflation. So if that happens, if aggregate demand is too far out, right? The Federal Reserve waited too long to start raising interest rates, right? Aggregate demand got way out here. And so then you either have to reduce spending or you have to what? You have to start raising interest rates to bring aggregate demand back. If you don't, prices are going to go up. What are they trying to do now? Raise interest rates to bring aggregate demand back and keep inflation lower. So at B, you can either wait for prices to adjust, in which case you might have a recession for a while, or use macro policy to shift aggregate demand, or at least to try to shift aggregate demand. You can't make people spend more money, but that's the idea. Okay. So shocks at the economy, most of the time it affects spending. It could affect the supply, could affect full employment, could have negative supply shocks, right? You could have positive supply policy shocks, like the infrastructure bill. That affects the full employment line, long supply curve line, but it also affects spending. Question then is the spending effect on aggregate demand bigger than the effect on long-run aggregate supply and FE? Right. No, there's no right answer to that one, actually. Could go either way. You just have to make the argument in that case. Which one do you think is the bigger impact? But generally, spending happens first. The spending impact happens sooner in the short run. The effect on the aggregate supply from, let's say, infrastructure bill is going to happen in the longer run, because it takes a long time to build bridges and roads and put up new infrastructure for broadband, and all that. That takes years, whereas the spending happens sooner. All right, let's go back to sort of 518. And I do need to go pretty soon here in the next 5 minutes. But so go ahead, Brittany.
Okay, I have test related questions. It is only chapter 9, correct?
It is chapter 8 and 9.
8 and 9. Okay.
Yeah, because the last one was through chapter 7.
Okay, we just didn't have a homework assignment for chapter 8. So I think that's what threw me off.
That's correct. That's correct. Because there's not. It's more of a reading chapter than an analytical chapter, right?
Okay, and then are you going to be posting the past semester questions?
Yes, I will, and that will happen probably tomorrow or Saturday at the latest. I will not have a moment to do that tonight. Yes. I actually need to create that. I haven't actually done this in the past, so you're getting the benefit of that.
Very helpful.
I actually need to create that from the past exams, and I just need to I need to go back at those past exams and kind of grab the questions out of there that are the relevant ones and put them together in a single document.
Okay.
So that's the reason why I can't just like press a button and make it happen. So yeah.
And then last question for you: can we have an office hours on Monday like we did before the last test?
Yes. And I was going to say something about that. So I will before I say something here, let me get my calendar just to make sure I don't say anything that's wrong. Yeah, so I mean, so Mondays are in general, there are meeting days. That's what I'm trying to get at. So it'll probably be 6 o'clock, 6:15. But it's also so that everybody that may be working during the day, et cetera, people in our distance learning program, for example. But for those of you that aren't, yeah, 6 or 6:15. Yes, yes.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Yep. Any other quick questions anybody has before we conclude? Like I said, I will have the recording available. It won't be tonight, but tomorrow at some point. Post that. Okay. Any
Thank you, Dr. Simpkins. This is helpful.
good. That's the point. That's why we
And
do
so
it.
were the demonstration videos.
Well, yeah, so actually, thank you for saying that. Well, you know, Brittany's here, she's looked at them already too, I know that. But so that's why I said in my schedule announcement, right, on Sunday, like, you gotta watch them, you gotta do all of them. You can't, no, you gotta, like, there are a bunch of them here, and there are a bunch of them for a reason, because this is where everything comes together. Yeah, thank you, good, that's the point. I'm glad to hear that, so, good. All right.
Have a good night.
Anything else? Yeah, I've got to meet my wife for dinner, and then we got to be somewhere for an event, and then I have a letter of recommendation to write tonight. So yeah, it's a
Stuff.
busy day today. So
Yes,
but
busy
I wanted
day.
to make sure that we had opportunity to do this. So yeah.
Well, thank you. Have a good night.
All right. Good night.